You are watching Maximus Aviation.
Well, hoo boy, this ought to be a fun one. I'll start with the main topic you saw on the title and thumbnail. Then I'll have a few short Airbus updates, and then I have some thoughts. So this story comes by way of Fortune magazine. The CEO of Airbus has a view on who's to blame for the trade wars that have engulfed the global economy. But this time, unusually, he's not pointing fingers at China. Speaking to a German publication with a name I can't pronounce, Guillaume Ferret agreed that the rise in protectionism had forced the company to engage in more nearshoring as a security measure for its supply chain. As it is now, Airbus makes 60% of its aircraft in Europe and 20% each in the US and China. However, on this day, Ferret diverged from the typical Western sentiment of blaming China for rising hostilities. Instead, Ferret appeared to point the blame at Europe's greatest ally, the United States. Ferret said trade wars are in full swing, and I want to remind you that in recent years it wasn't the Chinese who imposed tariffs on European aircraft, but the Americans. Ouch. Well, Airbus has factories in China and some big pending orders. So do you think that has anything to do with the sudden change in attitude? More on that later. But when Xi Jinping came to Paris in early May, he called Airbus a success for China. However, Ferret's comments are just the opposite of that of European CEOs, but that's unsurprising given his company's occasional turbulent transatlantic relations, says Fortune magazine. Airbus and rival Boeing have been at the center of a decades-long trade dispute between Europe and the US, which accused the EU of providing Airbus with illegal state subsidies through cheap loans, an argument the World Trade Organization agreed with. Yeah, that was pretty obvious for all to see. However, as a result, the then Trump administration hit Europe with a 10% tariff on aircraft in 2019. And the tariff stayed in place under the Biden administration until they were suspended for 5 years in June of 2021. The dispute ended after the EU threatened to impose 15% tariffs on U.S. aircraft for similar Boeing subsidies. However, it's not just the U.S. that's the problem here, because there are some parallels with the European Union's current probe into Chinese automakers BYD and Geely. The EU is expected to slap import tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in the coming months, adding to the protectionism hitting global trade. And Ferret's interview will do little to ease that tension, particularly given the series of recent calamities at its main rival Boeing, which have helped Airbus to grab the global market share. But after the Boeing MAX was grounded for nearly 2 years in 2019 and 2020, and just as it appeared it was righting the ship, Boeing was then hit by the Alaska Airlines blowout in January, forcing the grounding of nearly 200 737 MAX 9 jets and plunging Boeing back into a crisis of confidence. However, not just preoccupied with trade wars, the Airbus boss is also concerned with how Europe is preparing for the bullets and rockets variety as the Russia-Ukraine conflict barrels on and tensions rise in the Middle East. Fortune magazine says that the EU and the US have often been at loggerheads over European NATO memberships generally falling short of spending the requisite 2% of GDP on their militaries. On this point, at least, Ferret seems to agree with the states. Ferret pointed out that the US spent 5 times the amount that the EU did on armaments, and that up to 3/4 of what Europe did spend was on weapons produced in America. Ferret said the EU needed to address the inevitable fractures that come from several separate governments trying to cooperate on arms procurement. Each European country has its own armed forces and natural interests, while the US only has one Air Force, one Navy, and one Army. European needs are not synchronized, Ferret said. And Ferret concluded his interview by calling for a security and defense agreement between the EU and the UK. Okay, so we're going to talk about that topic a little bit more in a minute. However, in a related story from Bloomberg, Airbus is holding discussions with assorted Chinese airlines regarding the potential sale of more than 100 A330neo wide-body aircraft, saying the possibility of a deal has been spurred on by President Xi Jinping's recent visit to France and his conversations with French President Emmanuel Macron. Those familiar with the development have said the terms of a potential deal are still being discussed and that as of yet there is no sign of when an announcement could be made. The A330neo has been somewhat of a disappointment to Airbus when compared to its predecessors, the A330-200 and 300, Together they accumulated 1,445 orders before being replaced by the new and improved new engine option series. But Bloomberg says that with China once again halting imports from Boeing, Airbus may be seizing its opportunity to present more attractive terms to the Chinese airlines to purchase these A330neos. And since we're talking about Airbus, more news in from Simple Flying. The highly anticipated Airbus A321 XLR is nearing the end of its certification and flight testing. Airbus has also released a plan of how it plans to support the XLR customers in the early stages of the plane's entry into service, as well as along with its long-term support. And then still in the Pacific, good Airbus news from Australia as the IATA, the International Air Transport Association, a global trade association, gave their seal of approval to Qantas for the extra fuel tank for the Airbus A350-1000 needed for the Project Sunrise. After a delay announced earlier this year, Qantas has confirmed that Project Sunrise is now back on track, with a third fuel tank for its fleet of ultra-long-range A350-1000s having been certified. On February 22, 2024, Qantas explained that delivery of its fleet of new Airbus A350-1000s would be delayed by 6 months because the regulator had requested that the aircraft's center fuel tank be redesigned. At the time, Christian Shearer, CEO of Airbus Commercial Aircraft Business, said, "We have to redesign the center tank, the extra fuel tank, that will allow the Sunrise mission, and that's what explains the shift." On June 4, 2024, at the International Air Transport Association's annual meeting in Dubai, Qantas head Vanessa Hudson announced that the extra fuel tank, which will enable 22-hour flights from Australia, had received approval from Australia's Civil Aviation Authority. According to the Sydney Morning Herald, Hudson said, "We're working very closely with Airbus and the first aircraft are due to arrive in mid-2026. It passed all the certifications now, so we're feeling very optimistic about the delivery timetable." Until the delay was announced earlier this year, Qantas was expecting the first 24 A350-1000s to start arriving in 2025. Qantas initially ordered 12 A350s in 2022 and then a further 12 in 2023 for Project Sunrise. Project Sunrise was a project Qantas was working on to provide non-stop flights from Sydney and Melbourne to New York and London, thus the need for the extra fuel tank. Okay, so back to China. As an American, am I offended by Gil Frey's pot shots he took at the US? No. Why? Well, because it's just the cost of doing business in China. However, what I am offended by is that the once mightiest country in the universe, the United States, along with arguably the second, the EU or Europe, who once teamed up to free the world in World War II, and also who had the mightiest manufacturing in the history of the world of planes, ships, tanks, and cars, and TVs and toasters all the way through the winning of the Cold War against the USSR. What offends me the most is the world sent all their manufacturing jobs to China where labor is cheap. And there's only one rule that all companies from Apple to Amazon to Airbus all have to follow, or lose that cheap labor that gives their stockholders high returns. And that rule is don't ever talk bad about China. And so whether it's Airbus or Boeing, the US or the EU, anytime they apologize or heap praise upon the communist dictatorship of China, well, as a guy who lived through the great years, frankly, well, it just makes me sad. But that's what I think. How about you? I know what you gotta do. Let me know down below. And until we meet again, please stay safe and hug somebody you love. And as always, yeah, this is Maximus.